Coming back to the ethics of this, the saying goes that if you're not paying for a service online, then you are the product.
That's right. Yeah.
And so,
which is a great line, by the way.
It's a great line. Yeah. My students say all the time, we use this because it's free. I'm like, it's not free.
Yeah. You're the product. It's your data, basically.
Yeah. Exactly right. So the business model is now no longer even that thing overtly. Yeah. It is the data they're collecting behind the scenes, and therefore what they're doing with that data behind the fact. Is there any consensus about the ethicality of that as a business model, especially when it's often kind of hidden from the consumer, especially children, for example? Like a lot of games are free, so Candy Crush, those types of things, they're free. They use the same psychologists that created the gaming system within, say, casinos, for example, to get your mind wrapped around and think, oh, I got to do one more, I got to do one more, right? Is that somehow kind of pernicious or unethical, or is it just an extension of people's weakness?
Well, I think that raises another great question. So we know most applications that basically monetize off of data or ads, and that require active users, embed a lot of psychology into user interface, into what information comes into your feed. Because over time, they're mapping the things that trigger you, basically.
And just to clarify, when you say using psychology, essentially you're saying using the weakness that they know that exists within human behavior collectively in order to keep us there.
Yeah. So from a behavioral science and psychological perspective, we know that we are less in control than we often think we are.
Yeah.
Right? And there are certain triggers, colors, for example, information, sounds that tend to have influences on people's behavior.
Yeah.
And a lot of these companies that, particularly social networking sites, for example, spend a lot of time actually actively thinking about this to ensure that users spend as much time as possible on their site. Because as they do that, they'll use it more, they collect more data from that, and then are able to feed into the model again.
So my last question about this from a data standpoint is, we're talking about these implications for us. What does this mean for the next generation, especially from an ethics standpoint? Because one of the things that we've discussed is that the only major difference that they found kind of between previous generations and this generation from an ethics standpoint is their perception of privacy.
That's right.
And they're living in a world without privacy, essentially, right?
At least in the way we would have thought of when we grew up.
Sure, right, exactly. And so, how do we perceive the next iteration of this? Do we think that with distributed ledger technologies and other blockchain technologies, will we be able to control our own data, own our own data, kind of determine what people see, or is this just going to be a new way to solidify this power of the data?
So that creates a very interesting dichotomy in terms of the future. Because on one hand, there's a big, so blockchain and other technologies are in some respects more anonymous, right? Even though they're open, they're also anonymous in terms of, kind of protecting people's identity.
As anonymous as the system wants them
That's
to be.
right.
Yeah.
And so in some senses, some of the fintech technologies that we think about now actually create some greater levels of anonymity than might have existed in a traditional financial system.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a lot more information that was private that is now public as well. So it's a very interesting dichotomy that people will have to live in as they get older. And I think when we think about our students and our children as they grow older, they'll live in a world that's definitely less siloed. So thinking about, this is a bank, this is a consumer company, this is a store, those kind of distinctions I think will start blurring, as you alluded to.
Yeah. So one of my favorite kind of fake news clips of all time was from this website called The Onion. And they did a story, this is like 10 or more years ago, so it's very prescient in nature, but it was talking about Facebook, and they revealed just a joke, but they revealed that Facebook was actually a CIA protocol that was a secret program to get people to post their private information in a public way. And they were joking about it because they were saying like that, they called it Operation Overlord, I think, and that the leaders in Facebook were actually CIA operatives. And the idea was they had been working as in an intelligence agency to get private information on people for so long, and now they realize that everyone just posted anyway, and they have like logs of where they're going and whatnot, right? So the idea is, obviously again as a joke, But the idea being that, you know, we live in a way, in a society where so many things are open, and even the concept of privacy, as you
it's
said,
very different.
it doesn't even mean the same thing that it used to mean.
Well, and to tie that back into something you mentioned about national security. So the Facebook example is perfect for that, because we know in the most recent U.S. presidential election that there seems to be a lot of very clear evidence that there were certain elements tied to various entities in Russia that kind of use Facebook as a platform to try to influence certain election outcomes in the United States. And so this is very much this idea of a weaponization of data and to influence outcomes that have very important national security considerations, right? Who will be the leader of an important country in the world? And so we're seeing that.
So the same use of data that can make it easy for a large retailer to send you a personalized coupon is the same analysis of data that can also convince you to pick a certain candidate in what is supposed to be a democracy.
That's right.
This is a challenge.